Mr. Takumi once stated in an interview that I can't seem to find anymore, but that I definitely read, that the second case of an Ace Attorney game is the most important one. This may sound surprising to some fans of the series, since the last case in the game is generally the biggest and considered the most epic and exciting, and the one that brings a lot of the themes of the game together. But his reasoning was that while a player would probably have the patience to finish the tutorial, the second case would be the real test of whether they would stick with the game and play it through till the end. This philosophy is reflected in the Ace Attorney games that are written and directed by Takumi, particularly the first two games. The second cases in these games are bigger, more tightly tied to the personal lives of the main characters, with more at stake if they lose, not just than the tutorial, which is naturally going to be a shorter and simpler case, but also than everything else in the game, except for the final case, which gives the player a big thrilling finale as a reward for playing through the whole game. I'm telling you this so that you can understand when I get into talking about Turnabout Sisters that this case is a big deal. This was the case that Takumi intended to hook players on Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney, and by extension, the Ace Attorney series as a whole. And in many ways, he succeeded admirably. This case did get many players hooked on the series, including me. And yet, when people list their favorite Ace Attorney cases, something that fans do a lot online, you will almost never see Turnabout Sisters on the lists. And when people list their least favorite Ace Attorney cases, it does occasionally turn up on those lists. There's a reason for this. Turnabout Sisters is flawed. From a storytelling standpoint, it is noticeably flawed. How exactly? I'm about to get into that, but first, a warning. Like I said, Turnabout Sisters is a big deal. In the first 3 minutes of the case, there's a major spoiler that affects the main characters for the rest of the series. Basically the complete opposite of the first Turnabout, where I wasn't worried about spoiling anything at all. Also, I'm going to be quite critical of this case, and I don't want that to affect your enjoyment of it. So if you haven't played, or at least watched the case yet, and don't want everything to be spoiled for you, I strongly advise playing it before watching the rest of this video. I'm also going to link to some videos of some fan dubs that were done in this case at the end of this video that are pretty good. The first one has the best quality, but sadly was never finished. The rest of the videos were done by a different group and have lower visual and audio quality, but they pick up right where the first one left off, finish the case, and still do a pretty decent job. So if you don't have access to the game, you can skip to the last minute of this video right now and follow the links to watch those. Okay, now that you've been warned, let's get into Turnabout Sisters. There's a lot to praise here compared to the first Turnabout, but also a lot more to criticize. The case opens with Mia having a phone conversation with someone named Maya, who is quickly revealed to be her sister. By the way, those two names are a lot less confusing to read than they are to say out loud. Mia tells Maya that she wants her to hold on to some evidence she's going to be using in an upcoming trial. That piece of evidence just so happens to be the thinker clock that Larry gave her at the end of the last case. Except Mia says that she took the insides out of the clock and is using it to store some papers. Maya agrees to hold the clock, but tells Mia that she better take her to a nice burger joint to repay her, because Maya, like a proper American youth from America, loves burgers. In the Japanese version, it's ramen. I actually like the burgers better. It's funnier to me for some reason. So Mia ends the call and is about to leave the office for the evening when she is confronted by an unseen person. The unseen person demands Mia hand over something of theirs, which Mia insists she doesn't have, but the unknown person knows it's in the thinker clock. Then the person hits Mia on the head with the clock, and we finally get a brief look at who it is. A man in a pink suit with lavender hair. First Frank saw it in his purple suit, and now this guy. The running theme here seems to be a guy who wears a traditionally feminine colored suit is probably evil. Cut to Phoenix waltzing into the office about 15 minutes later. That is incredible timing, although whether it's incredibly good or incredibly bad, I couldn't say. Phoenix realizes something is wrong when he smells blood. Is my nose just not very good, or does that seem unlikely? And he quickly finds Mia slumped beneath a window with a girl in a purple kimono crying over her. This is, of course, Maya, who, if the series has been on your radar at all, you probably realize is somewhat important due to her prominence in both fan and official art. Maya faints, and it takes a few minutes for her to recover and explain who she is. Interesting little side note, early concept art of Maya features her standing facing forward with fists clenched in a fighting pose, with notes saying this would be her first appearance and she was facing someone she thought was a killer. Based on these notes, it sounds like Maya was originally going to think Phoenix killed Mia. This may also be from the first draft of the game when Phoenix was still going to be a detective. Her character design is actually pretty consistent with how it ended up in the final product. Phoenix checks Mia's body, and yeah, she's dead. Quite recently, he can tell by the fact she's still warm. The victim of this case is Mia. Apparently, this case was at one point going to be the first case in the game. I think it's a good thing we got to spend a case with Mia before she died, getting to know her a little. It makes this scene more meaningful. Phoenix and Maya's conversation, as well as any chance they had to properly mourn, is cut short by the arrival of the police, who are called by a woman who saw the crime scene from an apartment across the street. The police are too late to save Mia, but not too late to make things worse. The main policeman on the scene is Detective Dick Gumshoe. The names Dick and Gumshoe are old-timey slang for detective, which makes the pun of his name translate to Detective, Detective, Detective. His first name is not a reference to his personality, although if all you've seen of him is this scene of this case, you might think otherwise. There's a receipt with Maya's name written on it in Mia's blood on the scene, and when Gumshoe sees it, he immediately assumes this means Maya must be the killer. This logic has been used in the Da Vinci Code and about 1,000 other stories involving murder, and it's always wrong. As a general rule, if it looks like the victim wrote down the killer's name in one of these stories, just assume that's not what happened. The logic behind this idea doesn't hold up to scrutiny anyway. First of all, you're counting on a person who is on the brink of death to be of sound mind and not delirious. Secondly, when all that's been written is a person's name, you don't know why, especially in a situation like this where it's a loved one. This could have been a goodbye note that she didn't live long enough to finish. But Gumshoe is working from the incompetent law enforcement agent's handbook, so he declares that Maya is the killer, and the poor girl is immediately clapped in handcuffs and taken to the police station while still reeling from the death of her sister. So the case is set up. We've got a victim, a defendant, and a mystery. What were those papers Mia was hiding, and why did that Liberace-looking fellow murder her over them? And this intro is pretty great. There's immediately a personal stake in the case, and just enough information is thrown the player's way to show that there's a lot more going on that we don't know yet. The actual gameplay begins with Phoenix talking to Maya in the detention center following her arrest. Obviously, he's eventually going to end up defending her in court, but that doesn't happen right away. In fact, Maya specifically asks Phoenix to go to another lawyer and ask him to defend her. A lawyer with a lot more experience than Phoenix, whom Mia told her to go to if she ever got in trouble. Maya also tells him that she recorded her final conversation with her sister, but her phone was confiscated by the police. Phoenix also asks her what's up with her clothes, a reasonable question since dressing like you're in Meiji-era Japan isn't exactly normal in modern times in what is most definitely America, land of the Freedom Eagle. Maya tells him it's nothing weird, she's just training to become a spirit medium, as totally normal people do. Well, thank goodness, for a moment I thought she was some kind of weeb. I was gonna have to recommend giving her the electric chair. And then you learn that the trial is actually tomorrow, and Maya has until 4 p.m. to get a defense attorney, or she's going to be assigned a public defender, who are notorious for being not very good. So you go to visit that lawyer Maya wanted, and he's not in. So then you go to the crime scene to convince Detective Gumshoe to give you Maya's phone. While there, you learn that the prosecutor for this case is a man named Miles Edgeworth, who Phoenix is already familiar with and apparently is very, very good at his job. He always gets a conviction, and there are rumors that he might use not entirely legal methods to do so. Bad news for Maya. You also learn that the prosecution has a witness, the woman from the apartment across the street who called the police. So since the attorney Maya wanted is still not in, you go to visit the witness. Yeah, that's one thing about this series to consider. It tends to be very linear. Occasionally you'll get to do things out of order, but for the most part you learn a piece of information or find a piece of evidence that unlocks a new location or a conversation or triggers an event. This continues in a chain, and that's your investigation segment. If you make a wrong choice, you can't advance until you repeat it correctly. And this does allow for more consistent characterization and a more tightly written story, but it also can make the amount of player involvement feel quite limited. And if someone were to say these games didn't appeal to them for that reason, I would understand. The witness is a very pink woman named April May, who is ditzy, flirty, and completely uncooperative. She also has a bit of a freak out when you try and peek in one of her drawers that's propped open slightly with a screwdriver, so that's a little suspicious. After April May kicks you out, you go back to give Maya her cell phone. She listens to that conversation the player heard during the opening cutscene, cries, and then finally you get to meet the lawyer her sister wanted her to hire. His name is Marvin Grossberg, a man of enormous stature in the legal world, and also literally. Heh, moderately highbrow fat joke. Grossberg is Mia's former mentor and boss, and seems quite friendly at first, but when Phoenix tries to ask him to represent Maya, he suddenly gets very nervous and says he can't help because he's too busy, which seems a little unlikely because he just said he had lots of free time. Then it goes a step further when Phoenix angrily tells him he'll find someone else, and Grossberg tells him that no experienced lawyer is going to touch this case with a 10-foot pole. Grossberg apologizes and seems genuinely sorry, but refuses to say any more. This is the setup for Phoenix, and by extension the player, to take the case, which was obviously inevitable. I mean, of course the player character is going to need to take the case. But the way it happens actually really works for ratcheting up the tension. Something has spooked all these powerful defense lawyers. Whatever is going on here, there's something a lot worse than some petty burglar at the heart of it. So now it's time for Phoenix to go visit Maya again and officially take the case. Although actually you can choose a dialogue option to refuse to take the case, but it doesn't really let you. People who play games are probably already familiar with this kind of non-choice, and normally I would ask why bother with the choice at all if you don't really get to make it. If you choose to refuse, though, you do actually get an amusing little piece of character dialogue where Phoenix says he won't help Maya, only to immediately say he was just joking, followed by Maya badly pretending to find his terrible, terrible joke funny. You know your joke was bad when the person who's looking at an impending lengthy prison sentence feels the need to make you feel better about it. The other important part of this conversation happens because Phoenix asks Maya where her parents are, and since she's only 17, it really seems like they already should be there. This leads to Maya telling Phoenix one tiny section of the tragedy of the phase, a 26-volume historical summary of the misfortunes of the most cursed family in the world. Maya's father died when she was little. That's the simple part. Her mother is where things get complicated. She might still be alive, but no one knows where she is. Maya's mother was a spirit medium like Maya is training to be. 15 years ago, the police approached her to ask her to use her powers to help them solve a very difficult murder case. And yes, this is a thing that happens in real life sometimes. Maya's mother channeled the murder victim, supposedly, which led to a man being accused and arrested. But then the man was found not guilty. Things might still have been okay for Maya's mom. Her assistance to the police department was done in strict secrecy, except there was another man who learned about it and leaked the story to the press. The police department was humiliated, and for Mrs. Fay, well, it was all over for her. This case had already been a media circus, the O.J. Simpson, Scott Peterson, Casey Anthony of its day. And now that it had been revealed that the police had arrested an apparently innocent man based on the words of a self-professed psychic, well, clearly this was ratings gold, and the press swooped down to feast like the ravenous vultures they frequently are. Mrs. Fay was hounded relentlessly by paparazzi while lengthy exposés were written and broadcast about how she was a fraud, and probably an unfit mother, Satanist, and a racist too. I mean, why not, right? And then in midst of this relentless media onslaught, Maya's mother disappeared without a trace, never to be heard from again. Also, the man who leaked the story to the police was named White, and I'm sure this rather long and complicated story and that name, which Maya makes a point of telling you, will not coincidentally turn out to be linked to Mia's murder. After this enlightening conversation, it's time to go back to April May's apartment and investigate her drawers that she was so sensitive about you poking around in. You'll know this because the game flat out tells you to. That's another thing about this case. The guidance and hints can be a bit heavy-handed at times. On the other hand, this is the second case most people will ever play. So you could argue that having a fairly gentle learning curve will be a good thing for most people. But I really feel like this is one the players could figure out for themselves. April May isn't in her apartment, which is the best possible thing that could have happened, because it's time to use what anyone who's played these games knows is one of a lawyer's most powerful tools: trespassing and performing an unlawful search for justice. Turns out that drawer the prosecution's star witness didn't want you looking in has a wiretap in it. How Phoenix knows what a wiretap looks like on site is never really explained. Maybe that's just something they teach you during your second semester at law school. The bellboy comes in, and assuming you're a visitor instead of someone who's robbing the place, tells you April May has a phone call from a Mr. White. Probably just a coincidence. Obviously, there's something much bigger going on here than a simple robbery like in the first case. This looks like a full-blown conspiracy, what with the trial being rushed to court the day after the crime, defense attorneys being frightened away from the case, and now a witness for the prosecution who was wiretapping the scene of the crime. Maya's being railroaded by someone with a disturbing amount of influence over the legal system. That concludes part 1 of the case. These longer cases are split into parts, and after each part, the player can save their game. Part 2 is the start of the trial and opens in the courtroom. It's here that the player first gets to meet Miles Edgeworth, a prosecutor who dresses like it's 19th century France. Right away, he seems more competent than Payne, which makes him a bigger threat. Edgeworth announces that the prosecution has evidence and a witness that Maya Fey is the killer. What Maya's motive could possibly be is never mentioned. Edgeworth calls our old pal Gumshoe to the stand. Gumshoe mostly goes over a bunch of stuff we already know at this point. April May calling in to report the murder, Phoenix and Maya being found at the crime scene, and the note that says Maya written in Mia's blood. The player can challenge the idea that Mia wrote the note by showing an autopsy report that says Mia died instantly after getting hit, but will immediately get slapped down by Edgeworth, who has a convenient updated autopsy report showing she might have lived long enough to write the note. Shenanigans seem to be the order of the day. Edgeworth calls up April May, and it's time to really put everything that was learned during the investigation to the test. May claims to have seen Maya murder her sister, but pressing her quickly causes her to start struggling with various details, like failing to mention Maya's odd clothes. Keep pushing her, and she eventually slips up and calls the Thinker statue a clock. And then you can use a strategy pretty similar to the one from the first case. Just keep pushing her about how she knew the statue was a clock, and use what you've learned up to this point to disprove all of her excuses. Eventually, she freaks out, and you can reveal the wiretap. Edgeworth argues that while the witness committed a crime by illegally tapping Mia's law office, it's irrelevant to the current case, but the judge is not convinced. But May has another card to play. She says that she couldn't be the murderer because the bellboy brought her iced coffee just before the murder, which is actually not a euphemism, although with this girl you could certainly be forgiven for thinking otherwise. So she has a witness and an alibi. Phoenix, of course, wants the bellboy to testify, but Edgeworth is determined to fight him every step of the way. Eventually, the frilly prosecutor relents, but lays down an ultimatum. If Phoenix can't find any new leads or contradictions in the bellboy's testimony, he has to give up the case. So the pressure's on. The bellboy comes in, and at first it doesn't seem like there's anything in his testimony that's useful. He confirms that April May was indeed in a room just before the murder, so her alibi checks out. But then Phoenix decides to ask him about when she checked into the apartment, and it's a really good thing he did because the bellboy reveals that May checked into the hotel with a man he didn't see when he brought her coffee. So there's a new suspect now. Of course, Edgeworth isn't happy at all with this, but the judge decides it's worth looking into the identity of this strange man and adjourns the trial for the day. Now the player has some much-needed investigation time to get to the bottom of this. Out in the lobby, Phoenix has a quick chat with Maya, who seems a little confused at first, asking if she can go home. Sorry, kid, your name's not Harvey Weinstein. It's a holding cell for you. They do briefly discuss the mystery man, and Phoenix states his commitment to solve this mystery and bring Mia's killer to justice. It's not exactly gonna be easy, though. For starters, April May refuses to talk about the mystery man's identity. At all. Not really surprising, but it definitely makes tracking down Mystery Man harder. The next logical step seems to be to talk to the bellboy, who is actually really eager to help. He's convinced that his involvement in the case is going to make the hotel, and him personally, famous. Unfortunately, he doesn't seem to be able to give any useful information right away. What the player actually has to do is go to Marvin Grossberg's office again. It's not that difficult to figure out just because there's only a limited number of places you can go, but it sure seems more random than, hey, maybe I should try and check out that suspicious drawer that the shady lady wouldn't let me look in. I mean, maybe a hint would have been nice here, too. Grossberg is out again, and oddly, the fancy painting on his wall is missing, too. He also has 2 photos of people on his desk, both marked DL6 incident. The first is a middle-aged woman with black hair, who we'll later learn is Maya's mother, Misty, and the second is a man with lilac-colored hair. Gee, he looks familiar. That second picture is the one you need, so Phoenix just takes it, because sometimes to solve a felony, you gotta commit a few misdemeanors. Showing the picture to the bellboy will have him confirm that that's the man Maya was with. How convenient. And bless his soul, he offers to sign an affidavit right then and there that this is the man. Savor the experience of someone cooperating with you. It won't happen often. Speaking of uncooperative, it's time to wring a little more truth out of Miss May. Showing her the picture and the affidavit will get her to admit that that is the man she came to the hotel with, and that his name is Red White, her boss, who runs a so-called intelligence gathering agency called Blue Corp. When asked about his activities on the night of the murder, she clams up and says she doesn't want to end up like her. We already know this guy did it from the opening cutscene, but if we didn't, this would be a pretty good giveaway. So at long last, it's time to come face to face with Mia's killer. Okay, you know how Red White dresses? The way I see it, there are only 3 types of people who dress like that. Successful hip-hop artists, pimps, and flamboyant homosexuals. Now this is Red White's office. Draw your own conclusions. White turns out to be an extremely arrogant man who's fond of making up words with the mistaken belief that it makes him look smart. As a side note, in the Japanese version, he would slip gratuitous poor English phrases into his conversations, which was probably where the inspiration for making his localized name and company name a pun on the colors of the American flag came from. His Japanese name and company were a pun on small, medium, and large. White denies any involvement with April May's wiretapping, brushes off Phoenix's attempts to question him, and says he'll have to get him on the witness stand, but he probably won't be able to because White owns the courts and the police. He's not even subtle. Asking him more about his company and about the very familiar-looking painting on the wall will cause him to become increasingly hostile until he up and punches Phoenix, and tells Phoenix that there's nothing he can do because, again, he owns the courts and the police. I am above the law! He says to ask Grossberg, the former owner of the painting, how he got it, and then kicks Phoenix out of his office. We are just making so many friends today. Well, time to pry into Grossberg's secrets and see what kind of sensitive information he can be prodded into revealing. Where White was arrogant and hostile, Grossberg seems like a defeated man during this visit. Telling him that White is obviously blackmailing him, what with the missing painting and everything, will get him to spill his guts pretty easily. Again, it all goes back to the DL6 case, the one where Mia and Maya's mother Misty supposedly channeled a murder victim and accused a guy who was found not guilty. After that happened, the police were embarrassed and upset, so they were considering taking legal action against Misty Fey. So she lawyered up, as one does, and hired Marvin Grossberg to make sure they didn't screw her over after asking her for help in the first place. And Grossberg got them to drop all charges. And then Red White came around. At this point, everything about Misty Fey's involvement in the case, including the business with Grossberg, had been kept strictly confidential. but apparently White heard that something was up and started sniffing around, bribing Grossberg, who told him everything. Not only was the fallout so bad for Misty Fey that she disappeared, but the police department was far more humiliated than when the defendant was let off. They started looking for the source of the leak. So White came back to Grossberg and started blackmailing him for money and favors. Yeah, that's the thing, Grossberg. It turns out that untrustworthy people generally can't be trusted. For his part, Grossberg feels terrible about betraying the Fays and has paid the price for it for years. The problem is, the moment he stands up to White, he'll get destroyed. He tries to make himself less than completely useless by telling Phoenix to search Mia's office. She was collecting information on White for years, trying to build a case against him. It's all coming together. The only thing that's missing is evidence, which unfortunately is probably in an ashtray at Blue Corp at this point. But of course Phoenix doesn't know that yet. Fortunately, the Fey Law Office is now corpse and cop free, so it can be searched unimpeded. The useful thing is the file drawer. There's an article on Misty Fey, a bunch of newspaper clips about people who committed suicide with the word white written on them, and the entire W section is missing. So the thing to do now is confront White over this and accuse him of blackmailing these people and murdering Mia. Always give away your game plan. This leads him to calling up the chief prosecutor, accusing Phoenix of murdering Mia, and Dick Gumshoe coming over and arresting Phoenix. Don't worry, that's what you're supposed to do. That's progress. Phoenix gets to talk to Maya briefly and learn something important. The detention center looks exactly the same, no matter which side of the glass you're on. And now at last, it's time for the final portion of the trial, but now it's Phoenix's head on the chopping block. He reminisces beforehand about the legal reforms that have caused most defendants to be found guilty. Credit where it's due, all of this really ratchets up the tension nicely. But since this is the part where he's cross-examined, let's talk about my first major problem with this case. Red White. White is a fairly simple man.
I am above the law!
Corrupt, rich, an unrepentant murderer, and the most obnoxious human being on the planet. He's not a particularly complex or deep character, but I really wanted to watch him die. So he's a good motivator that way. The problem with Red White is that the case spends all this time building up the threat he poses due to his influence over the courts. Takumi specifically said that he wanted the villain of this case to be intimidating, so he gave him broad shoulders and a position of power in the legal world. The only problem here is that when Red White actually gets into the courtroom, his vaunted power over the legal system amounts to absolutely nothing. Before the trial begins, Edgeworth talks to Phoenix in the lobby and tells him that he's been informed that if he objects to anything Phoenix says, he'll get his way. He then says he's going to do his best to get a guilty verdict anyway, because that's his philosophy. It seems like he's trying to justify his involvement in something that's clearly unethical, and it's a nice little insight into Edgeworth's character at this point, as well as hinting that he and Phoenix have a history. There's just one teeny tiny problem. Edgeworth objects to numerous things Phoenix says and does in the trial, and most of the time the judge overrules him and lets Phoenix keep doing what he was doing. A new player won't have much context, having only played the tutorial case, but the cross-examination of Red White goes exactly like the cross-examination of any normal witness. It's no more unfair than it normally is, and the case spent all this time telling us that it would be. On top of that, Red White is kind of an idiot. His original plan was pretty good. Murder Mia, destroy the evidence against him, plan a witness ahead of time to falsely accuse someone else using the knowledge he gained from wiretapping the office. But he completely abandons this carefully made plan the moment Phoenix starts accusing him, even though Phoenix has no proof. So what new brilliant evil plan does he replace it with? He brags about how he's going to accuse Phoenix and use his connections to get him assigned a crappy defense attorney so Phoenix will be found guilty. Except, Phoenix is a defense attorney. Of course he'll just represent himself, you moron, especially when you brag about this right to his face.
I'm glad you asked that because I wanted to take this time to explain my evil plan.
And to top it off, when he testifies, it's obvious he barely prepared his story. He didn't visit April May to collaborate his testimony with her, which leads to inconsistencies that trip him up, like claiming he saw a glass light stand that he couldn't possibly have seen through the window from the apartment across the street. By the way, you can't call April May to testify again or ask him why his story is completely different from hers when he claims they were watching together through the same apartment window. Did she lie? If so, why? Why would he not testify? Because her testimony would be sufficient, as he claims, if she was accusing the completely wrong person. These are questions the game doesn't give you the option of asking, despite it being the most glaring problem with what he's saying. In the end, it doesn't matter, though, because White is such a moron that he starts quickly falling apart on the stand anyway. It's only Edgeworth who poses a challenge at this point, repeatedly rushing in to save him. White is just not a great villain. Edgeworth says that White must have seen the glass light stand when he planted the wiretap in Mia's office, which White agrees with and claims happened a couple weeks before the murder. So that's how he talks his way around knowing about the light stand. And for a moment it looks like Phoenix is stuck. Then something happens that's very important to the future of the entire franchise. Phoenix hears a voice, turns around, and sees Mia, and promptly faints, as one does when one sees a dead person at her own murder trial. He wakes up in the lobby, sees her again, and faints again. Our hero, everyone. And then when he wakes up a third time, Mia is wearing Maya's clothes and hair. And remarkably, this isn't a fever dream. What's actually happening is that Maya is channeling Mia's spirit, which in this universe involves her physically changing into the person she's channeling. At least Mia has a reason her clothes don't fit now. Up until this point, the case had left the whole psychic powers thing up in the air, but at this point it's confirmed. Supernatural abilities are actually 100% real in Ace Attorney. This is something that sets it apart from a lot of courtroom dramas and mysteries, and would be fully explored for story possibilities later in the series. There is one little thing that bugs me, though. While it's fleshed out a lot more in later games, the series is pretty consistent with how spirit channeling works. When a person channels someone and physically transforms, everyone can see it. Except, apparently, when Maya transforms into Mia in the middle of the courtroom. Then everyone is just totally oblivious. It's especially bad in this case when it's her murder that's being tried. At least you'd think Red White would be a little freaked out. Hey, didn't I kill you? I'm willing to write this one off as an acceptable break from reality. Mia has a very helpful tip for Phoenix. On the other side of the note that says Maya written in her blood, which Mia confirms White wrote, is a receipt for that glass light stand that's been such a problem for White. She bought it the day before the murder, so he couldn't have seen it when he placed the wiretap. He could only have seen it if he was in her office the day she was murdered. The fake evidence that White planted is actually the real evidence that's going to nail him. Poetic justice. So Phoenix goes back into the courtroom and the player presents the receipt. And that's pretty much the end of it. Right? Well, it probably should have been, but no. Edgeworth claims he needs more time to investigate, and Phoenix is afraid he's going to pull some more antics if he gets the chance, but doesn't have any more solid evidence to stop him. And then, all of a sudden, Mia hands Phoenix a list of names and tells him to read them. He does, and Red White confesses to the murder. And the case ends. If you think that sounds really abrupt, anticlimactic, and nonsensical, yes. Yes, it is. It's by far the worst part of the case. First of all, it has nothing to do with anything the player learned and proved previously in court, which makes all the actions the player took seem pretty pointless. Certainly everything else discussed after Red White took the stand amounted to nothing. All Mia needed to do was list off some names. And why? Why does White confess? All Phoenix has is a list of names of powerful people who White is allegedly blackmailing, but no actual evidence. He threatens to take the names to the press. Okay, earlier he had a bunch of names of people White supposedly blackmailed into suicide. That wasn't enough to get White to confess. All White has to do is act like he doesn't know what Phoenix is talking about. Then the trial will go on for another day, and maybe Phoenix will get convicted. Are people really going to listen to a convicted murderer tell them there's this huge conspiracy among police, politicians, and law enforcement? And if someone does look into this and starts uncovering proof of it, White can flee the country and disappear. After all, he's rich. It certainly seems like a better option than confessing to murder, something that this series later establishes can get a person the death penalty. But it doesn't matter if it makes any sense or not. That's the trial. It's over. Obviously, Phoenix gets not guilty verdict after White's confession, and White is hauled off. But the case isn't completely over yet. Mia tells Phoenix to meet her in her old office that evening. But instead of Mia, Maya is there, back to her old self. She gives Phoenix a letter and he officially inherits Mia's law office. She also kind of hires herself on as his assistant. And thus, a new status quo for the first 3 games is set up. And we're definitely done with the DL6 case forever. Yep, that's never going to come up again. Turnabout Sisters is, as I said, a very important case in the series. A lot of things established here are prevalent from now on in the games. It introduces spirit channeling, along with 2 major characters who would be very important to the future of the franchise, Miles Edgeworth and Maya Fey. Edgeworth is going to get his own video when I cover Turnabout Goodbyes, because that's the case when the player gets to really properly know him. I almost did a companion video to this one featuring Maya Fey, but I'm actually going to save that for next time. Because while this case does revolve heavily around Maya, she isn't exactly in her normal role here. She's quite somber and subdued, understandably, and is absent for a lot of the case due to being locked up. I'll do a discussion on her when I cover the next case, Turnabout Samurai. A big thing that this case establishes is that trials in this series aren't going to be isolated episode-in-a-bottle deals. This is a lived-in world, and what happens in the court has consequences outside of it for these characters. It's because of all the important things that this case sets up that this video ended up being so long. You kind of need to know this stuff to understand things that come later. Turnabout Sisters laid a foundation for the rest of the series to build on, and it turned out to be a pretty great foundation for future stories. It's just a pity that the trial itself ended in such a cheap, rushed, disappointing way. It really lets the air out of what is otherwise a very solid and certainly very important case for the franchise. If you have your own thoughts on this case, feel free to let me know in the comments. As I said in the last Phoenix Wrong video, I'm going to do a couple of 40k Armory videos after this, and then Turnabout Samurai in a video about Maya Fey. Also, I may throw in another video or 2 on whatever else I feel like talking about, whenever I feel like it. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like and subscribe. Feed the beast! Feed it! Next retrospective video is Turnabout Samurai.